Someone you respected, maybe a former colleague, maybe someone at your own table, looked at you and said it, and you knew exactly what it meant. The conversation was over. Not because you'd been refuted. Not because they'd produced a fact you couldn't answer, but because they'd invoked something larger than argument. Something that made the argument itself feel beside the point. You're on the wrong side of history. And the room moved on, and you sat there with everything you wanted to say still unsaid, and a feeling you've carried since that you still can't quite name. That feeling isn't embarrassment. It isn't even anger, exactly. Or not only anger. It's the particular frustration of someone who sensed, correctly, that something had just happened that had nothing to do with the truth of the matter. A door had been closed. Not with a key, with a phrase. What I want to give you today is not a counter-accusation. I'm not interested in flipping the phrase around and sending it back. What I want to give you is something more durable than that. The understanding of what the phrase actually requires in order to mean anything at all, why it works as a social weapon even when it means nothing as an argument, and the 3 questions that expose it without triggering a shouting match. The framework comes from a man who was subjected to that phrase himself, not by casual acquaintances, but by the most celebrated intellectuals of the 20th century. In the most intellectually prestigious city in the world. They told him he was on the wrong side. They told him history had already passed its verdict on his kind of careful, skeptical, empirically grounded thinking. They were very confident. History disagreed, but we'll get there. First, we need to understand what the phrase actually requires, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. And the next time someone deploys it at your table or in your office, you'll have something to say that's more useful than silence. Here is the structure of the claim. Stated plainly, when someone tells you that you're on the wrong side of history, they are not making a political argument. They are making a claim about history itself, capital H, and what history is capable of doing. They are saying that history has a direction, that this direction is knowable, that it carries moral authority, that being aligned with it makes you right, and being misaligned with it makes you not just incorrect but obsolete, retrograde, already condemned by a tribunal you can't appeal. Think about what that requires history to be. It requires history to be omniscient, to know where it's going. It requires history to be inevitable, meaning that resistance isn't just futile, it's a category error, like arguing with gravity. And it requires history to be morally authoritative, to have the power to pronounce verdicts on human choices, to separate the saved from the damned, the progressive from the reactionary. Those are not political attributes, those are divine attributes. Omniscience, inevitability, moral authority. That is the description of God, or at minimum of the function God performs in a theological system. And what the phrase right side of history does in every single instance of its use is transfer those attributes from God to history without acknowledging the transfer. It is a theological claim wearing secular clothing. Raymond Aron identified this structure in 1955 in a book called The Opium of the Intellectuals, and the title itself tells you what he thought of the move. He was watching the most sophisticated intellectual culture in Europe organize its entire political imagination around a framework that was, in his reading, a religion in every functional sense except one. It had no God above it to hold it accountable. It had a prophet Marx. It had sacred texts. It had an elect people, the proletariat, chosen by history to redeem the world. It had a fall from grace, a catastrophe in the past that explained present suffering. And it had a salvation event coming, the revolution, always arriving, never quite here, perpetually just over the horizon. What it didn't have was a God who could be held accountable for what was done in his name. The human beings who claimed to act on history's behalf, who claimed to know where it was going, to be on its right side, to be permitted therefore to do what was necessary, had no limit above them. When there is no limit, Aron observed, the people who claim to act in history's name don't stop. That's the machine. Strip off the Marxist labels and it doesn't disappear, it finds new clothes. Now I want to show you what this machine looked like in operation, because this is where the phrase stops being philosophical and becomes something you can verify. In the 1930s, Western intellectuals traveled to the Soviet Union and came back with reports about the future being built there. The phrase they used wasn't identical to right side of history, but the structure was the same. History had a direction. The Soviet experiment was where it was going. To criticize Stalin's methods was to miss the point. You were reasoning from within the old world, applying standards that history had already superseded. Millions of people were dying in the collectivization program. The intellectuals who were on the right side knew this or could have known it, and the framework they carried gave them permission to set it aside. In 1974, Alexander Solzhenitsyn published the Gulag Archipelago, 3 volumes of documented testimony about what the Soviet system had actually been doing for 50 years. The response from significant portions of the Western intellectual left was not engagement with the evidence, it was dismissal. The book was Cold War propaganda. It served reactionary interests. To take it seriously was to align yourself with forces that history had already condemned. The book was not propaganda. The camps were real. The deaths were real. The dismissal was an act of the secular religion's most reliable reflex. When evidence threatens the framework, the evidence is assigned to the wrong side. In American universities between 1966 and 1976, Mao's Cultural Revolution was discussed by serious people in serious journals as a genuine experiment in human liberation. Tens of millions of people were dying or being destroyed. The people discussing it as liberation were not stupid. They were operating inside a framework that told them history was on the side of the experiment, and that therefore the suffering was, what? Transitional, necessary. The price of arrival. You'll notice the pattern. In every case, the claim to be on the right side of history did not produce an obligation to engage with what was actually happening. It produced the opposite, a permission structure to dismiss evidence that threatened the verdict history had already pronounced. The phrase doesn't open inquiry, it closes it. That's what it's designed to do. That's what it's for. Which brings us to the question this still doesn't answer, and I told you we'd get there. Why do intelligent people fall for it? Not the credulous, not the lazy, the genuinely brilliant, the deeply read, the Sartres of the world. Why does the secular religion capture exactly the people you'd expect to be most resistant to it? Aron's answer is one of the most uncomfortable things he ever wrote, because it removes the comfort of explaining the phenomenon as simple stupidity or simple malice. It was neither. The secular religion offered something that the alternatives couldn't match: certainty with a purpose. The traditional religious frameworks that gave people a sense of history's meaning were, by the mid-20th century, under enormous pressure. Intellectually embarrassed, socially unfashionable, unable to explain the catastrophes of the previous 50 years in terms that felt adequate. Into that vacuum stepped a framework that offered the same goods: meaning, direction, moral clarity, the sense of participating in something larger than yourself, but in a vocabulary that felt modern, empirical, scientific. You weren't following a god who might or might not exist. You were following history which was verifiable, which was real, which you could read in the arc of events. The cost of entry was accepting that history had already pronounced its verdict on the past, and that your job was to align yourself with it. Once you'd accepted that, the phrase right side of history wasn't a conversation ender imposed from outside. It was a logical conclusion of the framework you were already inside. You genuinely believed it. And the people who didn't accept the framework, who kept asking uncomfortable empirical questions, weren't refuting you. They were demonstrating that they didn't understand the framework. They were, almost by definition, on the wrong side. This is why the phrase lands with such confidence. It isn't usually deployed cynically as a deliberate manipulation, though it can be. More often, the person using it has genuinely internalized the structure. And the phrase flows from that internalization as naturally as any other expression of sincere belief. Which is exactly what makes it so hard to answer with an argument. You're not arguing against a position. You're arguing against a framework that has already categorized your objection as evidence of your obsolescence. That's the machine Aron named. And once you've seen it, you need to be able to do something with it in a real conversation, not just in a YouTube video. Before we get to the 3 questions, I want to point you towards something that extends what we've covered here into a practical field guide, because understanding the mechanism is one thing. Being able to use it at the table, in the office, with the person you love who's been using this language for years requires something more specific. What I put together in the Intellectual Survival Kit is exactly that. 7 frameworks drawn from Aron's work, each designed to be used in an actual conversation, not just understood in theory. The secular religion checklist is in there. The 7 markers that let you identify the structure in any argument, not just this one. So is the conversation map that shows you how to deploy the 3 questions without the exchange turning into a shouting match. The link is in the description. Now, Raymond Aron. He published The Opium of the Intellectuals in 1955. He was 45 years old. He had spent the previous 2 decades watching his colleagues in the French intellectual world commit, one after another, to the framework he was now taking apart. Sartre was at the height of his influence. Merleau-Ponty had recently written the most sophisticated philosophical defense of Stalinist methods that the French left had produced. The consensus was not soft or ambiguous. It was confident, credentialed, and carried the full weight of Parisian cultural authority. Aron's book was not received as a contribution to debate. It was received as a betrayal. He was not refuted in the main. He was categorized. He was a cold warrior. He was a defender of capitalism. He was, in the language that mattered in those circles, on the wrong side. His arguments weren't engaged with the seriousness they deserved, because the framework the arguments were challenging had already assigned them a place, the position of those whom history had already passed by. He continued writing. He continued teaching. He continued insisting, with what he called modest hope, that political life required judgment under uncertainty rather than alignment with a predetermined direction, that the absence of certainty was not a failure of nerve, but the condition of honest political thought. He was marginalized. He was condescended to. At parties in the city where ideas were the only real currency, he paid a genuine social cost for what he believed. Then, the Soviet Union collapsed. The Gulag's reality became undeniable. The regimes that had claimed history's mandate either fell or revealed themselves as catastrophes. The intellectuals who had been so certain of which side history was on spent the 1980s and 1990s in various states of reconsideration, qualification, and, in some cases, silence. Aron died in 1983, before the full reckoning arrived. But the verdict came. The man who had been told, with enormous confidence, that he was on the wrong side of history by the people who were most certain they knew where history was going, was vindicated by the very process they had invoked. Let that land for a moment. The phrase used to silence him became the proof that he was right. The history that was supposed to have already condemned his careful, empirical, anti-dogmatic liberalism turned out to have condemned something else entirely. And the people who had wielded the phrase with such certainty had nothing left to wield it with. That is not a political point. It is a historical fact. And it changes what the phrase sounds like when you hear it next. So here are the 3 questions. Not accusations. Not counter-accusations. Questions. The kind that do what Aron spent his career doing. They ask the person making the claim to specify what they actually mean, and in specifying it, to confront what the claim requires. The first question is, who decides? If history has a right side, someone must be in a position to know which side it is. Who has that knowledge, and how did they come by it? This isn't a rhetorical trap. It's a genuine epistemological question. The phrase assumes an answer that it never provides. When you ask it calmly, what you're doing is inviting the person to either defend the claim or notice that they've been making an assumption they haven't examined. The second question is, has the right side ever been wrong? You're not asking about your side or their side. You're asking about the track record of the claim itself. The people who were on the right side of history in 1932, in 1966, in 1974, what happened? This is not a what about move designed to deflect. It is the most empirically direct question you can ask about a claim that presents itself as empirical. If the right side of history has a track record of catastrophic error, what does that tell us about the reliability of the verdict being pronounced today? The third question is the one Aron would have asked, and it's the sharpest. What would it take to prove you wrong? This is the question that distinguishes a framework capable of learning from a secular religion that cannot. A genuine political argument can, in principle, be falsified. There is some evidence, some outcome, some development that would cause you to revise it. A religious claim cannot be falsified, because every piece of contrary evidence gets reinterpreted as a test, a transition, a temporary deviation, the fault of those who didn't implement the teaching correctly. If there is no possible evidence that could change your mind about which side history is on, you are not making a political argument. You are making a confession of faith. And you should at least know that about yourself. You don't have to say all 3 in the same conversation. Often one is enough. What they accomplish is not a victory. Aron was not interested in victories. What they accomplish is the thing he cared about most. They named the structure, and named things can be responded to. Unnamed things only wound. There is a version of this video that ends in triumph. The conservative who finally has the phrase that wins the argument, the framework that makes the other side look foolish. I don't want to give you that video, because I don't think it exists, and I don't think Aron would have respected it. What he would have offered instead is what he always offered. The sober recognition that political life is genuinely uncertain, that we are all operating with incomplete information, that the absence of historical inevitability cuts in every direction, including ours. The right response to dismantling the secular religion's claim to know where history is going is not the counterclaim that we know better. It is what Aron called modest hope. The recognition that the free world, with all its failures and inconsistencies, is worth defending not because history has ordained it, but because actual human beings, with actual lives, actual families, actual faith, flourish more within it than without it. That is an argument. It can be examined, it can be challenged. It has to make its case. That is not weakness. That is the only honest position available to someone who has thought carefully about what the 20th century actually taught. You are right to feel that something was wrong with the phrase. You are right to sense that the conversation had been closed rather than concluded. What Aron gives you is not the certainty that you are on the right side. It is the tools to insist that the questions stay open, that the evidence keep being counted, that the argument keep being made, which is, in the end, the only thing that actually has a track record. The question I'll leave you with isn't about the phrase. It's smaller and I think more important. The next time someone in your own circle, not an adversary, someone you love, uses this language, what do you want to happen in that room? Not who wins. What becomes possible? That's the conversation worth having. Tell me about the first time someone used that phrase to end a conversation with you. I read these,